So today I am reading a sample of my new book, The Sailor Without a Sweetheart, which came out April 2024. And this is in my Preston series, but it is a Persuasion-inspired story. So Nate Preston is a naval captain, and 6 years ago during his training, he fell in love with Amy Lamplugh, and they had plans to marry, but she ultimately backed out. And now they have ended up on the same estate. She's visiting her sister who lives in the dower house, and he is visiting her in-laws. He's a guest as he's awaiting a court martial. And, neither of them were expecting to see each other ever again. So that is the setup of the book. And I'm going to read a scene from the beginning. They have encountered each other by surprise at a group dinner. And Amy suffers from a chronic illness, and she's so kind of overcome by both her illness and the shock of seeing Nate that she faints. And so this picks up right after she has fainted. Nate leapt to Amy's side before he knew what he was doing. She lay crumpled on the floor just behind her brother-in-law's chair, most of her face and stomach turned down. Thank God for the imported Arabian carpet lining the room, or else Amy's head might have hit hard wood. Nate touched her hand to rouse her. Miss Lamplugh. Already, her eyes were blinking open. A good sign. Nate had known many people, women and men, to faint. It was only when they stayed that way for more than a few seconds that one really had to worry. You fainted, he told her, since in his experience of sailors collapsing, they never believed what had just happened. Are you injured? She blinked at him again. Hazel eyes. Had he ever forgotten? They were that magic color that changed with the light. On summer afternoons, they had always seemed as green as hedgerows. Now they were dark and amber, like seawater in a sandy harbor. She's fine, Mrs. Brumridge, the former Miss Mary, replied from her seat. You mustn't be alarmed, Captain. Lady Olivia had rounded the table by now and crouched on Amy's other side. Have you hit your head, my dear? No, I'm sorry, don't make a fuss. The words came weakly out of her. She was still deathly pale, and her fingers felt like icicles. Nate discovered he was holding onto them like some kind of lovesick husband. He let her go. Perhaps the family's physician can be called. There is no need, Mrs. Brumridge said, her voice growing shrill. This is one of her episodes, that is all. By the time Dr. Beckett arrives, she'll be fresh as a daisy. You really mustn't be concerned, Captain Preston. Was she scolding him because she did not want to pay a physician's fee? Or because she did not want Amy receiving his attention? Miss Mary Lamplugh, after all, must have known about his offer of marriage. Perhaps Amy had even confided in her about their plan to elope. Was the younger sister playing protector because she was afraid Nate had returned to whisk Amy away once and for all? Nate schooled himself to keep indignation from steaming out his ears. She's right, Amy said, but her voice was still soft and weak. I need rest, that's all. She looked like she needed much more than rest. The Amy of 6 years ago had cherubic cheeks and a generous helping of flesh filling out her shoulders, bosom, and, when she had let him catch her in his arms, waist. Nate wouldn't have recognized this Amy if he hadn't committed so much of her to memory, for now she was all skin and bones, as if she had gone a month without rations. In the parlor, Nate had been stricken by how her eyes sank into their sockets and her cheeks hollowed into her jaw. Pair that with how her lips had no color, and was that a tremble in her hand as she reached forward, trying to rise onto her feet? This woman needed far more than a few hours in bed. But, as Mrs. Brumridge made clear, Amy Lamplugh's health was far from Nate's concern. I'll ring a maid and have the blue room freshened up for you, Lady Olivia said, wrapping an arm around Amy to help her stand. Oh no, I'd rather go home. At least her voice was beginning to sound steadier. To the dower house, I mean. Nate wondered if that really was what she meant. Would she prefer to be at Swanhill House? Or was there somewhere else, someone else, that she longed for but could not speak of? It didn't matter. The family had a course of action with regard to Amy, and it did not include him. Nate was about to return to his seat when she took a step on her own and promptly started crumpling back to the floor. He caught her, Because he was a naval captain, and he was standing right next to her, and that was what a gentleman did. Not because he longed to have her in his arms again. Oh, Amy cried, softly, for her voice was going weak once more. Thank you. She was a rag doll backed into his arms. Nate gripped her from behind with one hand on her left elbow and the other arm wrapped tightly around her waist. Gently, he rearranged the two of them so that her feet were solidly on the ground. You had better not walk just yet. Fred will see her back to the Dower House, Mrs. Bremridge said. Then he'll come back for me. Mr. Bremridge, who was still in his seat, turned around with a wince. I should be happy to escort you, of course, Miss Lamplugh. Only I did twist my shoulder last week. This had to be a farce of a family and a farce of a reunion of parted lovers. Nate had no choice but to offer his next words, even though he knew they would make him look overeager. I shall carry Miss Lamplugh, if you could show me the way, Mr. Bremridge. There was a pause, as everyone in the dining room considered the situation. Nate would welcome an objection, if only there were a better way to see Amy back to the Dower House without risking a fall and without requiring her to wait for horses to be hitched to a cart. Amy's hands landed on his, where it sat beneath her ribcage. It was still ice cold, but it was also firm, keeping him there. Thank you, Captain Preston. I do not deserve your kindness, but I will accept it. For a moment, Nate was transported back in time to a sunny afternoon at Swanhill House. They had left Amy's great aunt sitting on a chair by the edge of the lake and set out around its shore. Under a willow tree they had nestled together, Amy between his legs, her back against his chest and his against the trunk. He had felt every word vibrate through her chest into his. Almost as much as he had wanted to steal a kiss, he had felt the magic of that connection and had yearned for the moment to never end. At the time, he had thought it was the beginning of a lifetime. Now, he knew it was only a memory. He avoided Amy's eyes as he, with the sanction of the rest of the party, lifted her into his arms. Her arms looped around his neck, her head only inches away from his. Her perfume, lavender, filled his nostrils. Above his forearms, he could feel the boning of her short stays along her back. If he looked down, he would not look down. He was a gentleman. Mr. Bremridge walked ahead of them through the house and onto the gravel drive. The night was young, with enough gray twilight that the lantern Bremridge carried was hardly necessary. It is a quarter of an hour's walk, perhaps, Bremridge said. We'll be back before pudding. As if Nate was concerned about missing a meal. Mrs. Bremridge has the right of it, hasn't she, Amy? The man continued. These spells come on every now and then, and after a bit of rest, you're in the best of health again. Overexcitement, the physician supposes, which works differently on each person. That is true. The physicians do not have an explanation. Amy adjusted her grip on Nate, her bare fingers brushing against the nape of his neck. He refused to acknowledge his body's reaction to that. A bit of egg on your face, eh? Bremridge said, turning over his shoulder to smile at his sister-in-law. Fainting in the middle of a party like that? That was too much to be borne. Nate felt Amy shrink in his arms, though she had enough strength to keep her chin held high, even with the angle he carried her at. He spoke before she could. I've seen men faint at far worse times. Once, when we were in negotiations with the King of Dahomey, my lieutenant collapsed the very moment the king arrived. Without meaning to, he glanced at Amy. She watched him with wide, solemn eyes. What a fascinating life you have led. A life she had chosen not to be a part of. Nate looked straight ahead at the path. He had recovered from her rejection years ago. There was no reason to feel it sting again now. They turned off the gravel drive onto a path of packed earth and grass. Just a little bit farther now, Mr. Bremridge promised. Need you a rest, Captain Preston? No. He had carried heavier things longer distances, but there was no polite way to comment on Amy's weight, especially when it seemed linked to whatever unexplainable episode she was suffering from. He redirected the question. Have you need of a rest, Miss Lamplugh? No. She readjusted her arm again so that her elbow clung more tightly around his neck. Her head was that much closer. For just him to hear, she added, "I am quite comfortable." His body reacted in two halves. Joy, like sinking into a hot bath after days without a wash. For there was a part of him that had longed these 6 years to know that he could carry Amy in his arms and she would be comfortable, that she would hold on to him and not demand to be put down. Pain, like catching the splinters of a broken mast in his back. Because he had wanted this, had offered this, had been ready to risk his career and name and wealth for just this, Amy in his arms for the rest of his life. And she hadn't even had the decency to explain to his face why she would not marry him, had instead left him with a letter to memorize and twist into 1,000 interpretations. Know that I love you, and if circumstances were different, I would marry you in the very next heartbeat. You must forget me now as you go forth on your destiny. I shall look forward for your name in the newspapers, to hear what a fine, heroic naval officer you become. One day, I hope to read that you are married, too, and raising a family full of boys who will join you in defending goodness from the evils of the world. A good thing they were within sight of the Dower House. It loomed ahead of them in the dark, brightened only by a few windows where lanterns stood in wait. Bremeridge led them through the front door. Navigating the stairs with Amy in his arms was a bit of a challenge. Nate angled himself on a diagonal so that neither Amy's head nor her feet would hit the wall or banister. She tried to help by ducking her chin, her ear landing on his shoulder. Perhaps she didn't consider how much that felt like a lover's embrace. "This is Miss Lamplug's chamber," Bremeridge said, his words oscillating as they all realized together what an awkward thing it was for Nate to carry her directly to her bed. In those months that Nate had courted Amy, he had never so much as reached the same corridor as her room. He had never been able to fantasize about her in the specific decor of that Swan Hill bedroom, though he had certainly imagined her in his bed plenty of times. And now he lay her directly on a mattress. He watched her relax against a pillow, her lips spread in a small smile. He saw her legs stretch out, spotted the white silk stockings protecting her ankles from the evening air. It would be so easy to fall beside her onto the bed, to keep her in his arms, to kiss her once more with that senseless abandon that had so enchanted him 6 years ago. But Nate didn't want that. The desire he felt wasn't even real. It was a memory of a younger self that had loved a younger Amy. He didn't know this Amy, she who was a dutiful sister and obedient daughter. And she certainly didn't know him. He was just a stranger, straightening from her bed after doing her a kind deed. "I hope to find you in better health the next time our paths cross, Miss Lamplugh," he said. With a final nod, he took his leave of her.